Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, vigorous denial. The Prime Minister defends a cabinet minister named in an anonymous letter alleging the rape of a woman in the 1980s. After almost 3 years, the Aged Care Royal Commission delivers its findings but fails to reach any agreement on how the most vital reforms should be carried out. And he's back. Over a month since leaving the White House, Donald Trump returns to the spotlight.
Hello, CPAC. Do you miss me yet? Do you miss me yet?
Joining me on the panel, industry professor at Jumbunna Institute of Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney, and Labor Party member Noreen Young. Lovely to see you again.
Good to see you.
In Adelaide tonight, Chief Advocate for National Seniors Australia, Ian Henschke. Hi, Ian.
Hello, Ellen.
In Melbourne, former Dean of Medicine at the University of Melbourne and soon to be President of King's College London, Kshitij Kapoor. Lovely to see you again, perhaps for the last time on these shores.
Thank you for having me, Ellen.
And former President of ACOS and Aged Care resident MERLE Mitchell. Always wonderful to see you, MERLE.
Oh, thank you, Ellen.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum and on Facebook. The government is now mired in 2 sexual assault scandals, the latest implicating a member of Cabinet. A dossier detailing a harrowing assault, which allegedly took place in the 1980s, was last week sent to the offices of the Prime Minister, as well as Labor Senator Penny Wong and the Greens' Sarah Hanson-Young. It was subsequently passed on to the Australian Federal Police. Now, today, the Prime Minister was asked about this most recent allegation, saying he has spoken to the minister named in the anonymous letter.
And the police have had this matter referred to them. The individual involved here has vigorously rejected these allegations, and so it's a matter for the police. And at this stage, the Commissioner has raised no issue with me, and the Department Secretary was present for that call as well. That would cause me to take action under the Ministerial Code. That's where we are right now.
And all of this is coming just 2 weeks after the former Liberal staffer Brittany Higgins came forward alleging she was raped in Parliament. Ian, if I can start with you, the Prime Minister said in his press conference that he'd heard rumours about someone in his government late last year. He didn't ask around about it. Then he got this letter last Wednesday. He didn't read it. He referred it to the AFP, who are not investigating. They've confirmed, and he says there's no need for an independent inquiry. Is that all he is required to do?
Well, it's an interesting question. You might remember the Catholic Church was embroiled in matters a couple of years ago. One of them involved one of the top schools in Australia, Riverview, and concerns that someone had moved a pedophile from one state to another. They called an inquiry headed by Justice Warren, I think it was, a former judge from Victoria, and she looked through all the matters, and it was historical abuse going back to the 1980s, the same as this was, and at the end of it she wrote a report. And the Jesuits did this and the Church did this because they wanted to clear the air and say, well, if we've done anything wrong, what have we done wrong? Now, I think there is an opportunity here to both keep justice as it should be, in other words, innocent until proven guilty, but at the same time have an independent inquiry into the way these matters are handled and also the other matters that are there at the moment, because there are more than 1 or 2 cases with Brittany, the staffer. With other people have come forward. In this one, they could still do it and have in-camera evidence put before the inquiry, and I think it is possible to actually do something about it. So it's really a question of whether the government wishes to take that path.
Noreen, much has been made of the fact that the victim took her own life, and the suggestion has been made that this presents a real difficulty with due process for the person who's accused but not named here. Do you think it does? Can it still be investigated despite the fact that the victim is not around to give evidence?
I think this is a different case because we've read lots of commentary to say that the alleged victim wrote down and kept diaries and made statements to police despite withdrawing the matter, and also told a lot of friends and had laboured with this for a long, long time in terms of mental health and had confided in a lot of people. And they're in fact, some friends of hers have in fact written to various authorities to seek that it be dealt with. So I'm with Ian on the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. However, the accusation is that of a federal cabinet minister, and they're no more entitled to that presumption than anyone else in the community is either. If it was a workplace matter, we'd be dealing with it. A person would be investigated, and this is a federal cabinet minister. So I don't know.
Ian, you don't think that the fact that the complainant has sadly died is an impediment?
No, I mean, if you take that example I was talking about before, the Warren investigation into the moving of a pedophile around, she actually found against the provincial of the Jesuits who had died some years before about his activities involved in that. And I mean, this is why organisations, when they do hold independent inquiries, are not just looking into that particular matter, but the processes around it so that they can get things right. I mean, in this case at the moment, we're having a lot of people discussing, well, what should the Prime Minister do? What should other people have done? What should Penny Wong do? What should the leader of the Greens do, or whatever? They're all talking about it. Now, if you have an independent inquiry, it may well set the standard so that should this, and I hope nothing like this happens again, but should there be anything that's remotely like this, they have procedures, and it's important to have procedures in Parliament. They have rules of Parliament with all sorts of procedures. In this case, we're talking about a workplace where someone has been accused of something at a later date. That person is in a very high position of responsibility, so therefore you need to say, well, what should we do in a case like this?
Let me turn to MERLE now. The Prime Minister made the point today that he's spoken to the head of the Australian Federal Police, who didn't think that the Prime Minister needed to take any further action. That's a police assessment, MERLE. What about politically? Do you think it's possible to have a Cabinet Minister remain at his post with these sorts of allegations?
I think the air's got to be cleared. I think there has to be an investigation, and the community needs to have the confidence that these sorts of things are not going on in Parliament at the moment. And I think we've got enough evidence now about the toxic atmosphere in Parliament that we need to be taking every step that we can to make sure that that's addressed.
Kshitij, if this person was required to stand aside, it would be immediately obvious that he was the subject of these allegations.
Yes.
Without any confidence that a criminal standard of proof could ever be met.
And look, that's what makes it very difficult. I think there are two things we are trying to balance, and I have to say that no one knows how to do these perfectly. One is to in some sense, respect the rights of the person who's been the victim here as to how they would like their story or their accusations to be revealed when. And I think that's a very important right, and we try to respect that. On the other side is the presumption of innocence. And balancing that in a workplace is a very difficult matter, be that the Parliament or an ordinary workplace. So I think we can take it in two ways. We can either all be very horrified by this and think, oh my God, what's going on in the Parliament? Or we can realize that, look, this is a learning moment. This is perhaps not to do with any one political party or one, but this is a gradual evolution of society as we learn to balance these things. And if there were an inquiry, it could set the standards as to how do we in the future balance these two competing prerogatives. One, to respect the rights and the wishes of the victim, and the other, the presumption of innocence in real-life workplace situations. It's complex.
But Noreen, somebody made the point today, if it was a footballer and an allegation had been made, they'd be asked to stand aside.
Well, that's because there's been a lot of work in that industry over the past decade or so in order to have that culture have developed that if they are accused, they will stand aside. We're talking about a workplace where there hasn't been that focus and concentration on bad behaviour.
But why would they? I mean, if you were sitting in the Prime Minister's, everything, well, how are we going to break this down? Is the person an ongoing threat to any women in the building might be one question you'd ask. You might also ask, after the Brittany Higgins case...
We have to be exemplary.
Right?
Yeah. Well, don't you think, after the Brittany Higgins case...
And why? Just explain why.
Well, because we're the federal parliament and our procedures and policies and the way we handle these matters clearly aren't consistent with what the rest of us expect at work.
And therefore?
And therefore they need to be changed and reviewed, as Anne has said. In both instances, there needs to be a review. So there's certainly...
But back at the question of, is this person an ongoing threat? Public confidence in the procedures and the institutions and the parliament and all the rest of it. Where would you land on standing this person down, given that it would have the effect
of everyone knowing that was the person?
That's it.
I actually don't know. I think this is an ethical question and this is something that the Prime Minister has to grapple with. I remember there was those terrible accusations about Bill Shorten a few years ago and he came out and said it was me. You know, which, regardless of what you think, that was still the right thing to do. About
and we should be very clear. No charges were laid.
No charges were laid.
No
right?
police investigation.
So,
nothing.
You know, but he did say it was me. So I think there's
a decision was made not to lay any charges in that
certainly.
case. Right.
But the point is, the person who all the rumours were about on all those crazy conspiracy theory websites, not in the public domain, came out and said it was me. I think that there's a compulsion on the person to admit it.
So maybe it's a question for them rather than...
Yeah, it's an ethical question for them. Well, the Prime Minister has to say something. The Prime Minister can't get away with not saying anything, with being as dismissive and short as he was about it today. I didn't see it, but I've seen little grabs.
Well, it's worth remembering that former Liberal staffer Brittany Higgins broke her silence after seeing Australian of the Year Grace Tame on stage with the Prime Minister.
Every voice matters. Just as the impacts of evil are borne by all of us, so too are solutions born of all of us. I was abused by a male teacher, but one of the first people I told was also a male teacher, and he believed me. This year and beyond, my focus is on empowering survivors and education as a primary means of prevention. It starts with conversation.
But all too often, victims aren't being heard. A national survey by the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2018 found that 39% of women and 26% of men had experienced workplace sexual harassment in the past 5 years. Fewer than 17% of them made a formal complaint or sought advice, in no small part because they feared they wouldn't be believed or would be seen to be overreacting. Merle, let me start with you. In the 1970s, women's organisations started to press for legal recognition of sexual discrimination and harassment, and in 1984, Susan Ryan, the late Susan Ryan, ushered through that legislation in the federal parliament. Am I wrong to feel it doesn't feel like we're getting very far in all these decades?
Is it, sorry?
Are we getting anywhere, Merle? Have we got anywhere in the last 30 years, do you think?
I think we're getting somewhere in the fact that people will talk about it now. I think it used to be hidden, but I think Susan Ryan led the way when she created the capacity for people to actually come out and talk. And then suddenly we didn't do it for a while. But now, with Brittany and others that have come out and spoken, now's our opportunity, I think, to talk a lot more about what the solutions are. And the solutions have got to start at the workplace themselves.
I read that survey we were talking about there, Merle, from the Human Rights Commission, and one big problem they found in 2018, Merle, was that sexually suggestive comments or jokes was a big problem, and that the harasser later claimed to be surprised when their attempts at humour were met with offence and insult. Now, that suggests to me that all these years later we're still grappling with what, or some of us are, what constitutes sexual harassment.
You're absolutely right. We've got a long way to go, and we've got to be committed to actually doing something. And that's what worries me. Every now and again we make a step in the right direction, and then it all gets overturned and it doesn't happen. We have to really look at what's happening and start with the workplace and really put in place situations where people actually get the training as to what sexual harassment really is.
And can I make the point that that report made a number of recommendations and there's yet to be a response from government, and most of those recommendations went to prevention, which is really what we've been seeking for years.
But Noreen, the whole idea around that report was grappling with the problem that, you know, Dear Susan's legislation defines sexual harassment, 1984. Any unwelcome sexual advance, unwelcome requests for sexual favours, other unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature in relation to the person being harassed. That's pretty bloody clear.
Well, but in the trade we call that definition.
Right.
That goes to the definition and what that means, as was said earlier. And there's a lot of lawyers who can interpret that particular clause in a lot of different ways. And, you know, the person who made the sexual innuendo, their lawyer will say that a reasonable person doesn't take that as a sexual innuendo. So when Susan introduced the legislation, it was very well-meaning and very, it was fantastic, and it is a great piece of legislation, particularly given the circumstances that she was under in getting it passed. But there's always going to be lawyers who argue different ways of those things being interpreted, and that's one of the issues we have, and that's why we need to focus on prevention rather than dealing with it after it's happened.
Kshitij, I mean, and there's lots in that report on prevention, but one of the things that it sort of grapples with inconclusively, I think, in my opinion, is that the model at the moment requires a complaint from an individual.
Yes, yes. And that to me is, you know, having dealt with this in different organisations, first of all, it's rife in every organisation, and you know, while it's fine to be disappointed, we shouldn't be surprised when we hear about these things. The part that I find hard is that even within the organizations, our usual mechanisms for dealing and adjudicating these things are very scripted and very adversarial. The person has to write a complaint. Then there is someone in the organization to whom it goes. They can't talk to anyone else. They then orchestrate a certain finding. Then the other party has given a right. What we have lost, I feel, is within organizations a sort of informal mediation. The organizations become very rigid about it because they're afraid that, you know, they might get sued in terms of their responsibility. And that orchestrates and makes it a very long process. So at least in my experience, one of the biggest complaints of people who have complained is that it takes too long and they never actually find out what was done. Whereas on the organization side, they've done a lot of things they can't talk to anyone about. So I hope that we can find a middle path, which is not as legalistic as the courts, but doesn't brush things away either. And I haven't seen that nimble response within most organisations as yet.
And just a quick one, Kshitij, because you're taking on this extraordinary new role, King's College London. When I went to university, which was in the 1980s, you know, there was inevitably in each faculty one lecturer or tutor who was the perpetual adolescent who was having an affair with a student. I assume that that has changed. That's no longer acceptable?
I think in all our universities at the moment, there would be very clear guidance against that. And there would be ways, which is not to say that people cannot develop affection for each other, but there would be clear guidance, and is clear guidance, that should that happen, this is how you need to deal with it. You know, you need to let someone know, and then proper boundaries need to be constructed, because after all, you can't prevent people from liking each other. You just need to make sure that their official positions are not being used to abuse a relationship. So I think things have changed significantly on that account, but this is not to say that all is perfect. So, you know, new variants and finer nuances of the same problem still keep coming around.
Ian, that's universities. That's a formal workplace. What about the gig economy and casual work and less unionised workplaces? We also know that particular groups are vulnerable. Yes, women, but also people with a culturally and linguistically diverse background, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, LGBTQI people, disability, migrant workers, those in insecure work. We know those are vulnerable people. So, right, this is about power.
Well, look, of course it is. And look, and I can tell you from my days at university, I had one particular lecturer who used to like to take me up and have a cup of tea and used to occasionally put his hand on my leg, etc. So, I mean, it was happening between male lecturers and young men as well. I think he saw it as a platonic ideal or something because he was a classics lecturer. But, I mean, then when I was working as a student, I can remember working for someone in a gardening job, and they asked me inside, and this was a man yet again having a sexual move on me, making a move on me. I mean, people that are in positions of vulnerability, students, school students, casual workers, they are all at that risk, and that's why we need to actually change the attitudes across society. It's not just about the parliament or the public service or the universities. It's actually happening all across the system, and people are voiceless and powerless. In those instances, I didn't have anyone to go to when I was 17 or 18 working as a student or whatever, and we saw it in schools. That's why they had the institutional inquiry into child sex abuse, because it was actually rife and no one talked about it. Now, MERLE said before, we're talking about it now, but we also have to act on it. And I believe that it brings us back to the beginning of this conversation about Parliament. If they can't lead, because they're the leaders, and show us the best of possible behaviour, then what hope is there? And that's why the sports people decided to do it, because they started to realise that no one wants to go into sport if you've got pedophile coaches or if you've got abusive footballers who are actually physically and sexually abusive to people. I mean, this is why we've got to look at it as a societal issue and fix everywhere up. You know, because it goes on every day.
So,
I mean, as you said, it goes on every day.
So then, Noreen, you get to this really difficult point where you say we've got these really strong laws, and for the reasons we've been debating, people are reluctant to use these really strong laws. If you want to move to a more proactive model, which requires the employer to do something, what about if the victim doesn't want to do something?
Well, of course, that's the victim's choice.
Is it?
But well, no, it isn't, but it is.
I mean,
and we
it's
know
their choice whether to pursue a criminal matter, whether to take it to the police.
But it's also their choice whether or not to pursue it within the workplace. But we know
I guess
the
my
reasons
point is
that people
that the
don't.
only way it can be pursued? Is that the only way? Is there nothing else that the employer is required to do if the victim is saying, I can't do that?
No, of course not. Because that's the nature of the complaints mechanism. It is the onus is on the complainant to make the complaint. That's why it's called a complaints mechanism. No, there is nothing else that can be done. An employer, that's why they get away with it, because there's rumours. It's just like what we know has happened at the federal level. There's clearly rumours around the place, but unless there is an action, a complaint made, nothing can be done. It's employers, this is one of the reasons employers hide sexual harassers within their ranks, because people are too scared, aren't game to make a complaint, and so they keep doing it.
And is there a way around that respects victims' rights, do you think?
Well, I think, again, in talking about it, it's really positive, because I've seen a bit of commentary, the usual commentary from the usual male rights suspects about, oh, well, why did it take her so long to make the complaint? And we don't know what that process is like for individuals. We don't know the kind of what they go through and what their process has been, and it's the same in the workplace. None of us ever respond well in the moment. We don't respond at our own ideal in the moment to one of those, to sexual harassment or to sexual assault. It takes a really long time. So I think we have to be really mindful of all those exigencies around victims' rights.
Well, can I just say one thing, please, Ellen? And that is that in the education system, they moved towards mandatory reporting, where if someone was suspected of abusing someone, you know, they had to report them. I mean, in a sense, you could actually have a similar sort of system where when you suspect that someone is abusing or acting inappropriately, you should be able to report them. And maybe there's an onus on people to do that. But most importantly, I think we've got to recognise that we actually have a problem throughout our whole society, and it doesn't appear to be getting better.
You know, these conversations can be hard to have, so if you need to talk, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 1800 RESPECT, 1800 737 732. Sorry to do this to you. For more than 4 years, we've been treated to an unfiltered stream of Donald Trump's thoughts in between the time he spent fulfilling his duties as the most powerful man in the world. But since leaving the White House, and without the benefit of his Twitter account, he's been largely absent, silent. So perhaps it's no surprise that his first public appearance in months has received wall-to-wall coverage, which I ignored. He was speaking at an annual Conservative conference in America, and in typical Trump fashion, he came out on the attack. President Biden, the Supreme Court, trans women, even wind power all faced his fury. Apparently the speech went for almost 2 hours. But perhaps the most warmly received section of the speech was when Trump turned on the Republican Party itself, and in particular, those senators who voted to impeach him.
I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. Hello, CPAC. Do you miss me yet? Do you miss me yet? For the next 4 years, the brave Republicans in this room will be at the heart of the effort to oppose the radical Democrats, the fake news media, and their toxic cancel culture. We're not starting new parties. That was fake news. Now more than ever is the time for tough, strong, and energetic Republican leaders. We cannot have leaders who show more passion for condemning their fellow Americans than they have ever shown for standing up to Democrats. The Democrats don't have grandstanders like Mitt Romney, Little Ben Sass, Richard Burr, Bill Cassidy, Susan Collins, and of course the warmonger Liz Cheney. How about that? We won the election twice. I mean, you know, think about it. The future of the Republican Party is as a party that defends the social, economic, and cultural interests and values of working American families. And it's becoming a party of love. You have to see outside the streets. I mean, there's such love. The flag. Amazing. With your help, a Republican president will make a triumphant return to the White House. And I wonder who that will be.
You are watching The Drum, and with me on the panel are industry professor at Champana Institute of Education and Research at UTS, Noreen Young. In Adelaide tonight, Chief Advocate for National Seniors Australia, Ian Henschke. In Melbourne, incoming President of King's College London, Shatish Kapoor. And former President of ACOS and Aged Care resident, Mel Mitchell. When the Royal Commission into Aged Care was first announced, Scott Morrison said that what Australia needed was clarity after years of widespread non-compliance, neglect and outright abuse across the sector. The Prime Minister said it was time for answers.
I decided to ask one of the hard questions, and that hard question was asked in the form of establishing a Royal Commission, because I wanted to know what the quality and standard of care was being provided to my fellow Australians. And so we called that Royal Commission, and I warned the country we should brace for impact and be prepared for what would follow. And it has been a harrowing process.
Almost 3 years on, and the final report is here, and while it's full of recommendations and heartbreaking testimonies, what it lacks is clarity. Almost without precedent, the commissioners leading the process have disagreed to such an extent that the final report is split and includes conflicting recommendations.
I thank the commissioners because they're honest, because they know there are no easy fixes. In fact, they themselves couldn't agree on some fairly significant issues, and so they've honestly provided their different perspectives on that, and I welcome that, and we will consider those perspectives.
Now, that divide is over two fundamental pillars of the system: how it's funded and who oversees it. Commissioner Linnell Briggs, a veteran of the public service, thinks that aged care should be centrally managed by the government and paid for with higher user contributions. But Commissioner Tony Pagone, a former federal court judge with a background in tax law, disagrees. He says governments have failed and a new independent agency needs to be established to oversee the sector, with higher taxes used to fix funding shortfalls. Merle, can I start with you? What's your reaction to the split?
I'm horrified. I'm sure that many in the community are horrified. When Linnell Briggs and Richard Tracy were appointed, we were all thrilled because we knew that they would do a really good job. They worked so hard for more than 2 years, individually talking to people. They gathered together so many submissions. They had so many royal hearings, commission hearings, and they really put a lot of thought into what they should be recommending. Richard worked on that report up until the day he died, which shows something of his devotion to actually get things right. So when somebody else then comes in after Richard died and who hasn't done all of the research that Linnell and Richard had done, and then disagrees with what's happened when he hasn't done the research, I don't know where we go from here. I'm the same as lots of people. I am really, really shocked that this has happened. And I'm only hoping that there's enough push from the community to say enough is enough. We've got to have the funding. We've got to listen to the people who did all the work and implement those recommendations as soon as we possibly can.
Ian, if I can turn to you, just that notion that Tony Pagone hasn't done the work. I mean, if you look through, he has done a lot of work. He has a different view, and when you get to it, and I think it's I mean, except for the fact that we got this 15 minutes before the Prime Ministerial press conference, we would have done more work on it. But basically, when you go through this report, there's a whole recommendation for him saying he wants a whole new aged care commission. And he sets out how it's going to work. See, he said Commissioner Pagone. So against recommendation number 5 and the next few is his name, not Linnell Briggs, because they can't agree. It's like some sticky tape down the middle of a teenager's bedroom, one on one side and one on the other. But he's got a very clear view of what he wants. This commission has a presiding commissioner, a system commissioner, a quality commissioner, a complaints commissioner, a workforce development and planning commissioner, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander commissioner, right? He's got a very different view to Linnell Briggs, who says, no, just fundamentally restructure the health department. And they say to the government, A or B, you pick. What do you say, Ian? A or B, after all this time and all this money?
I do agree with Merle that Richard Tracy was a wonderful, in the true sense of a person serving the public, because he worked it up until the day that he died, and he wrote the report called Neglect. But that was in the first year of the Royal Commission. Tony Pagone came in after that, and I think he's very interesting in what he's actually looked at, because a person who comes from tax law has an understanding of how people can obviously game systems, etc. So I think what he's suggesting should be looked at very clearly, and I think ultimately the taxpayers of Australia need to get value for money, and they also need to get outcomes, and we should be focused on that. What Linnell Briggs is talking about is redesigning the system, and someone once said in the Royal Commission, this is not about renovation, it's about actually rebuilding, and you may have a foundation there, but most of it's got to be collapsed and started again. That's the sort of the view that many people are taking, but for the people that are sitting out there at the moment waiting for a home care package or wanting to get better care in aged care, I think that they don't care about us arguing about the fundamentals of governance.
Yeah.
That's not what people want.
Sure,
you can
Ian,
fix things
but we've got to get to who does this, right? We can all agree on what needs to be done, because there seems to be some clear agreement on that, at least in the commissioners. But how it's going to be done is pretty jolly fundamental. So my simple question to you is, the Prime Minister wants generational change here. There have been 20 separate reports over these years. Can the same people who have been failing to administer the system be left to reform the system?
OK, well, you've answered your own question there.
No, I haven't. I asked a question.
Well, what we know is that for 24 years since the Aged Care Act has been in place, that there has been these problems. Now, the highlight of today, I thought, was Greg Hunt saying he's going to tear up the old Aged Care Act and start again. So, I mean, it's not going to be business as usual, according to Greg Hunt. And let's remind people, he's taken over as the minister, and he's the one that is going to be remembered as the person who either fixes it or doesn't fix it. Even though Scott Morrison said, I'm calling this aged care to fix the problem, it's more than passing curious that he's put Greg Hunt in there.
All right. You're still not answering my question, so I'll give it a go with MERLE. MERLE, that's the question that I'm genuinely interested in hearing the answer to. We saw the Federal Health Department put in a submission to the inquiry, and all the way through they were saying to all these sorts of recommendations, whether it was mandatory staff training, minimum staffing ratios, a requirement to have nurses on site in residential aged care, none of which exists now. Yeah, fine in principle, but every time the Department of Health was saying, let's not overly be burdensome to providers. Yeah. Right? Well, so do you really have confidence that the Department of Health, which apparently is reluctant about some of these reforms, can implement these reforms?
I think at the moment there is so much pressure from the community to implement those reforms. I believe that they will, if enough work is done to show people that it's possible, and they must do it. And they must do it when they've done the research to show what needs to be done.
Even if potentially inside the department there are people who don't believe in it or don't think it's possible or practical.
Well, I must say I doubt that a bit. I really do. I think that there are lots of people in the health department that have been saying for a long time things need to change. And I'm just frightened if we don't make sure that we implement what more than 2 years of work. If we don't implement it, well, where do we go from here? I just keep thinking, when I was getting people to write their submissions, that this was the one opportunity that we had to make things right again. And if we didn't, we were failing our generation and all the generations to come.
Noreen, what there is agreement on, and where you stop getting these recommendations that see, recommendation 87, that's Commissioner Briggs, and then we go to, this other recommendation, that's not her. Or recommendation 27, Commissioner Briggs, recommendation 9, Commissioner Briggs, but not Tony Pagoni, all the way through this, little notes about, I don't agree, I do agree. But the what is pretty clear on what they're saying. Certificate 3 training. At the moment, there's no minimum training standard. Dementia and palliative...
higher wages.
Yep. Dementia and palliative care training. Increased pay. Increased minimum staff times. Up to 3 hours and 10 minutes by the middle of next year. Increasing to 3 hours and 25 minutes by the middle of 2024. At which point, mid-2024, there must be a registered nurse on site at all times.
Well, the Midwives and Nurses Union has been arguing that in a public campaign context for a long time. I'm not across the industry. I'm becoming more and more across the industry because my mum's in an aged care facility now. Hi, Mum, I know you watch. smiling. But I think what the public discussion's going to become clearly is training and wages, because I saw someone refer to the workforce today on Twitter as labourers of love. I've never heard that particular bit of terminology for a feminised workforce, and of course they are people who are tend to be recent immigrants, mostly women, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working in the industry. And I think we are going to have to start talking, if this report, and obviously I haven't read it as it was only released today and wasn't to the public. Obviously, we're going to have to talk about the professionalisation of the industry and pay equity and pay parity for a feminised industry, because we know historically that in the other feminised industries, women have earned a lot less than men have in similar occupations that could be graded in similar ways. Clearly, employers are going to object, as they always do, and this federal government usually takes their side, as is the case of small business. And we're going to have a really good community think about those objections and what we do in an ethical sense with the usual objections of employers, because this is people like my mum, MERLE, and people, all of us are going to be there at one time. Is that what you want? If you're that selfish, that's your only motivation, is that what you want for yourself? Untrained people who are earning a pittance, who have to work 2 and 3 jobs to be able to survive. Well, that is not what we want.
And some who don't want to be there because they're required under regulations from Centrelink and other places that they must go, or they lose their rights to payments. And that, I think, is a big problem in itself.
Is it? Yeah. Okay.
And MERLE, what about that notion of staff ratios and training? Should that be the focus?
Oh, yes, please, Ellen. The staff ratios have lots of outcomes. First of all, if you haven't got enough staff, the staff you've got are going to get very tired. So they go home feeling that they haven't done the job that they're employed for or that they want to give. And if you're not trained, then you may find it even more difficult to actually cope with those feelings. And I'm finding lots of staff who are saying, I'm just too tired. I'm really sorry. I haven't given you the care that you needed today, but I am exhausted. And if that's how people are feeling, why would you want to stay in the industry? We've got to make the industry more interesting for people, that they really do want to do the work, and it's work that they enjoy.
Kshitij, can I draw on your medical experience? The issue of physical and chemical restraints was one that was considered by the Royal Commission, and recommendation 65 is that only a psychiatrist or geriatrician should prescribe antipsychotics, and the inquiry did hear that these were used to control dementia behaviours, that they were overused. It's been described as a human rights abuse by the Australian Law Reform Commission about 6 years ago. Nothing happened with that. The response from the Federal Health Department has been a concern in its earlier submission that we don't have enough psychs and geriatricians. Okay, so, you're about to leave the country. Do you want to burn some bridges? Is it time the medical colleges stopped limiting the number of medical students who can be psychs and geriatricians for what looks like an effort to ensure their pay is still high?
Yes.
Brace for impact.
Right. Well, first of all, I might be leaving the shores. I'm not leaving the problem, because this challenge of aged care is a challenge across all our Western nations at the moment. So, we're just feeling one side of it. I actually see a lot of parallels in, we've just had Royal Commissions on mental health. And I find a lot of parallels about when we're talking about the mental health sector and the aged care sector, because I see both of them as poor cousins of the healthcare sector that we focused a lot on. And to me, one can get caught up on the finer niceties and technicalities of Certificate 3 or Certificate 4, but in the end, the solution to me is parity of esteem. Will this work be regarded by people as being of equal value and hopefully equally remunerated to the work in the other healthcare sectors and other mental health sectors. And I think that's the challenge for us. Are we willing to accord it the parity of esteem? Salary is just one part of it, but universities will have to give it higher prominence. We'll have to have more rewards and awards for it. But lastly, what that'll mean, and this gets to what Noreen, you were saying, are we as a society willing to pay more for it? So, you know, we can make it a technical question for providers and recipients, but really in the end, it's for the 90% of us who are not directly affected by it today, which is, are we willing to pay more?
Can I come in on that question, please,
Yes.
Ellen? Because we've surveyed people through National Seniors and asked them, are you willing to pay more? And they are. I mean, people want to pay more for better care, and they're prepared to pay more for better care. We've actually said to the government that there are people at the moment who would borrow against their homes to get the care they needed to top up the home care in their home or whatever. But the home equity rate that the government's offering at the moment is 4.5%. Now, we want that brought down to just cost recovery. You might remember that Paul Keating suggested...
let's just be really clear about what you're saying there. The pensioner loan scheme means that if you've got a house worth $500,000, you don't have to borrow 100 grand straight up and slowly pay for your home care, level 4 home care package. You just borrow more against your pension every week. And what you say is that the government, a little bit more, and the government lends it to you and it tops up your pension so you can afford a level 4, level 3 home care package. But you
you should get your level 4 package, which is part of what you need. But if you need extra care that you want, then you could top that up. And in fact, and that's what a lot of people say they want to do.
And you're saying that they're charging too high of an interest rate, given that the market is, you're not paying 4% for money anywhere.
No, 4.5%.
Right.
We've put in our federal budget submission, which was released last week, that we want effectively a Commonwealth home care loan scheme so that people can borrow against their house and do it. 80% of 80-year-olds own their own home. Yeah. And in most cities in Australia, they're worth many hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they're not prepared to go to a reverse mortgage operator or whatever, but they might if the government said, look, do you want to borrow a bit of extra money and get some extra care? Now, you can buy that care. It might be mowing the lawns, it might be cleaning the gutters, it might be staying in your own home. But at the moment, the government's not doing that, and we would like to see them do that. The other thing, of course, that we should recognise is that Australians have the right to this. I mean, this is going to be the big change, because what we heard today was that they are going to put an end to rationing of care. And if we've got the frailest and most vulnerable people in aged care and in their own homes, they should be treated as a health issue. And it gets back to what I said before. Greg Hunt, the health minister, is now in charge of aged care. It is a health issue, not a lifestyle issue.
Yeah, because it's a health issue.
Yeah. Mel, can I ask you on that question of chemical and physical restraint? I mean, that's horrifying. Is that a product sometimes of insufficient staffing, of maybe somebody with dementia needs someone to sit with them for some hours, and that chemical restraint is maybe an alternative to that? Similar questions, Merle, about something that the inquiry didn't seem to spend a lot of time looking at, which was the extraordinary level of physical and sexual assault that can happen in residential aged care. Is that an issue of insufficient staffing?
Of course it is.
Oh, I'm sure it is. We've had people here that the only way that you can keep them calm is to have somebody to sit with them all the time. Now, that involves a lot of staff and are very expensive. And if we had perhaps more people trained in how you cared for somebody with that level of dementia, we mightn't have that sort of problem.
So it comes back to the training issue again.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I can't speak more strongly about the fact that we have to look at the training. The training is done very often by private providers. The training for people who work with as patient attendants do, on the whole, 6 weeks training, and then they're fully qualified. And 6 weeks, how much do you learn in 6 weeks? You can't even do a sort of placement to actually learn the proper way to care for people. So that is vital, that we actually do look at that. Yeah.
A quick one on that, Ian, then we'll talk about home care packages. That again, the Prime Minister was saying to Anne Connolly, whose report on Four Corners, Who Cares, the ABC's biggest crowdsourced investigation resulted in this Royal Commission. You know, don't worry too much about what the Federal Department of Health is saying, notwithstanding the fact that it may be called on to implement these reforms. The government, the cabinet will decide. But it is interesting to look at the reaction of the Department of Health to this idea of mandatory staff training. They support it in principle and say it shouldn't be a barrier to staff who have the right attitude. And in terms of minimum staffing ratios, it supports the intent, but it should be tailored to residents' needs. Now, we know that people go into residential aged care older and older. So, I mean, does that cause you any concern?
It beggars belief that if you know that 50% of the people who are in aged care today, by the government's own figures, have got some form of dementia, and many people will say the figures could be as high as 80%, that there's no mandatory training for dementia. We just heard MERLE talking about how she sees people every day who need someone to be with them who's trained as a dementia caring specialist. Now, that is not just a 6-week online course run by a private training authority. The government has to get really serious about this, and I believe there should be aged care training programs in every single state of Australia where people work a certain amount of time on the theory and then on the practice. In the same way as we used to, we trained teachers, we trained nurses that way, we need to train people that way.
And we will talk a lot more about home care packages the next time we talk about this when I read 92
similar
onwards.
to the historical conversations we've had around childcare. And the fights the struggles that have been had to professionalise that industry. It seems like where we were in that context 25 years ago, and which of course still isn't resolved. But it really is about feminised labour.
Ian, just a quick one. The Prime Minister said today they can only roll out home care packages. Am I right in thinking there's 100,000 people waiting for home care packages? Is that correct?
There's 60,000 people without a package and about 40,000 people with a package that's below their level of need. And interestingly enough, the other day, just before the Royal Commission released its report, Flinders University Professor Radcliffe put out a survey that said that only 20% of people in home care felt they were getting cared for properly all of the time, and only 25% of people in residential care. So that's what we should focus on. They said they were going to make this a person-centred change.
Yes.
Just remember, it's the vast majority of people who are not getting the care they need, both in residential and home care.
And are you sympathetic to the fact that the government says they can't just click their fingers because of the workforce problem and solve this problem, that they can only roll out more home care packages at the rate that they have trained staff?
At the rate that they can train people. Well, where are they training them? See, now, it gets back to that thing again. If you want to take on something, you have to have a systematic solution. Now, you could be training 100 people in a centre today somewhere, but where's that centre? It's not there.
Right.
So you could have an aged care quality training centre set up in each state where people went in, they had apprenticeships, they trained for, say, 6 months classroom, 6 months practical. At the end of that year, they got a certificate, they got paid well for it. If they wanted to upgrade their skills to become dementia specialists in dementia units, they would upgrade their skills.
I
mean, this is what you do. I mean, just think about it. When the Japanese bombed Darwin in 1942 or whatever, we probably didn't have an air force, did we? We probably didn't have an aircraft building facility, but we took it on. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, the government has known about this, not just this government, but successive governments have known that we've got an aged population coming through and they haven't been training them at the same time, coincidentally. We knew when people came through education in the 1970s, we set up colleges of advanced education, we set up kindergarten training schools, we did all that because we valued children and young people more than we value old people. And that's what the report found, that a lot of this is about ageism and the mistreatment of older people.
I want to go back to MERLE. MERLE, the Prime Minister says the consumer, that's you, and your dignity has to be at the centre of all this. Do you feel like you are at the centre of the aged care system now?
No.
Well, I've got to be careful because where I live, I am certainly given the respect that I would hope I would get, and the care on the whole. I get the care that I want as well. I think I'm one of the lucky ones. I don't think many people are as fortunate as I have been in the care that I've got. And I think I can't emphasize enough about the need for training so that we have people here who really want to be here. And you know, I always go back to, there are a third of the people here who really love their job. There's a third are here because they're made to by Centrelink and others, and there are a third who hate it. And we've got to reverse
that doesn't sound good. That doesn't sound good, Merle. You said you're getting good treatment, but that doesn't sound like a good situation, because on one day in 3 you might get the wrong person walk through the door.
Well, I guess I've been lucky, the ones that I've got.
Can
But
I
I'm
just-
just on the whole.
Can I just
That's-
say how lucky we are to have Merle on this show as a client and as someone who's in the current situation. You're an absolute legend, Merle. Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And another thing I wanted to ask you, Merle, is during lockdown last year, gee, that was hard for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I didn't see my son or my daughter for 10 months.
Wow.
And
the Prime Minister said today, life's not something you wait out, it's precious. Every moment is precious. But I know that last year you didn't feel like that for some of the time. You've been such a loud voice during all of this and advocating and still working in the community. How are you feeling about life?
oh, I still sometimes, I've got to be careful what I say because friends get the wrong impression. I still get up sometimes in the morning and think, damn, I've woken up. But that's life, and you deal with what you get, and I've been able to get going simply because of my community connections and the sort of work and advocacy work that I've done, and I'm very grateful for that. Yeah.
We're grateful,
A powerful sense of purpose. A powerful sense of purpose over decades and decades. I printed out something that you were saying in 1991 about New Start during the last recession, and we could have run it tonight, and it was all the same issues you've been talking about for decades. So thank you very much for your contribution to this debate, Merle. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ellen.
Well, that is all we have time for. Thanks so much to our panel, to Noreen Young, Ian Henschke, Satish Kapoor and Merle Mitchell. Have a great evening, and Julia's in tomorrow night. Good night to you.
Thank you very much.